Chap,
Hematologist. Yep.
I am very excited about this episode.
Are you recording already, mate? I'm not even ready. I'm writing stuff down, mate. What are you excited about now, mate?
I am most excited about today's episode. Are you?
What is it?
The episode
What episode?
today.
Oh, yeah, I'm very excited, mate. It's very good. It's the Swift trial, mate. Mate, this thing was published last month in March.
Yeah.
And this is like a big paper that's been published and talking about blood products and which one's the best. And I don't know, mate. It's fantastic stuff. Who did we have to chat to?
It's unbelievable. Look, it's in the biggest journal, New England Journal of Medicine. It's the first sort of pre-hospital whole blood trial. And we have not only not just one, but two of the authors. We've got Professor Laura Green, who's a consultant hematologist and professor of hemostasis and transfusions. So she knows a thing or two about how to stop bleeding. And she's the corresponding author for the trial. And then we've got Ed Barnard joining in as well. And he is a self-proclaimed pre-hospital nerd.
Yeah, love it.
It's spreading, mate. But apart from being that, he is also, he's professor of UK.
Professor of the Royal Centre for Defence Medicine in the UK, mate. So here's you and I, me, paramedic, and you, paramedic turned doctor, interviewing these two world-leading, renowned professors over the other side of the earth, speaking about one of the most important trials. And I think they even said we are the first people to interview them post trial. So this is it, everybody. This is the exciting stuff. Get excited about it.
Hot off the press. Yeah. Some people find it hard to read a full paper, but I reckon if you just listen into this, you'll get a great sense of why they did the trial, what were some of the challenges, what were the lessons, and stick with it throughout. I think you'll find that we bounce nicely between sort of stats and methodology over to the clinical end and learn a lot about the sort of UK HEMS system, how that's all set up.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good way to do it, Alex, is I love my clinical stuff and you love your research. So you were given the hard-hitting questions and I brought it down a level 4 as well. So it's a good listen.
You were asking about the size and the number of helicopters and stuff. I didn't even consider that. But what about the sample size calculation? You know that? Did you consider that?
Yeah. It's lots of numbers in that and lots of maths.
So now look, a fascinating listen and lots more to come from this group. This is the first of many papers out of a huge data set. And of course, we've got Mark Yaser and the TOWAR, TOWAR trial. That can't be too far away. So we'll have to have him back on, talk about that soon too. And that's in a similar space. Anyway, what do you reckon, mate? Play the song?
Listen to the music, mate.
Shep, what an exciting episode. Tell us, who do we have with us today, mate?
And we've got Laura Green and Edward Barnard joining us from the UK, which is amazing. And thank you very much both for coming on, which I believe is your morning over there and our late afternoon over here. So we very much appreciate your time and effort to come and join us today. So I'll start with you, Laura. Can you give us a bit of an introduction about yourself and your title? As I mentioned to you before, it seems quite long and distinguished, but it's probably better to come from you than actually to come from me.
Thank you for having us in the podcast today. Good evening there in Australia. I'm Laura Green. I'm a consultant hematologist. I work for the National Blood Service, and I'm also a professor of hemostasis and transfusion at Queen Mary University of London. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Edward Barnard. Is it Barnard or Bernard? Sorry, Barnard. Barnard from the UK as well, also involved, and this is what the talk is about the SWIFT trial, which is obviously recently published in March 2026, and we're going to chat about that. So, Edward, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction about yourself as well, please?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks for the invite. I am definitely a pre-hospital nerd, so I was super
Excellent.
excited to get your email. So I'm the UK Defence Professor of Emergency Medicine. Most of my work is focused around combat casualty care, which is very pre-hospital focused, so blood, tourniquets, airway, that sort of thing. And I work on service at East Anglian Air Ambulance up here in the east of England, just north of London. And I work at Addenbrooke's Hospital, which is a major trauma centre in Cambridge.
Wow, very impressive. The pair of you, obviously, a lot of work and a lot of research behind you. What's going on there? Alex?
Yeah, very impressive, and thanks a lot for joining us and imparting your wisdom. So, a trial has come out hot off the press, and it's the SWIFT trial that a lot of people have waited for the results. Just publishing a pre-hospital trauma trial in a New England Journal of Medicine, that's a great accomplishment in and of itself. So, congratulations, and why don't you tell us what this trial set out to answer?
Ed, would you
Laura?
like me to do that? Okay. Yeah, so the trial was in pre-hospital setting, and we wanted to answer whether whole blood transfusion up to 2 units given in pre-hospital settings was superior to standard of care. And in England, the standard of care was with red cell and plasma in reducing combination of mortality or massive transfusion at 24 hours from randomization.
So I guess the background to it is that there's been a lot of excitement about whole blood in the trauma community in the last 5 or 10 years. Sometimes referred to as the elixir of life. And over Iraq and Afghanistan, we used fresh whole blood occasionally in patients who were really oozing and very coagulopathic following massive trauma. But up until now, the evidence base has been, I'd say, enthusiastic and messy in terms of really high quality controlled data comparing whole blood with component therapy. So this was an opportunity for us to systematically have a look at a whole blood versus standard care, as Laura says, is either red cells and thawed FFP or red cells and dry plasma as a pragmatic trial, really depending on what that air ambulance was already carrying in terms of plasma.
Yeah, that's great. And so I'm a paramedic by trade. So Alex is the one with all the smarts. I'm the paramedic. So the blood that you carry on your air ambulance, you said like a red cell concentrate. Would that be correct? With plasma, I believe you mentioned.
Yep. Yeah. So we've got 22 physician-led air ambulance services around the UK, and there's a bit of heterogeneity in how they operate their standard operating procedures, but generally it's mostly the same. And across those air ambulances, all of them carry red cells. So a normal bag of red cells, normally 2 units, some carry 4, and then a spectrum of different services, either carrying thawed, fresh frozen plasma, or a dry plasma, which I think everyone in the UK is using Lyoplas, which is from the German Red Cross.
Yep. Okay. No,
but we know we know that in the trial of the 10 services that took part, only 2 carried Lyoplas. The other 8 really carried thawed plasma, and then all services carried packed red cells.
Right. In the UK, are there any road-based services that transport blood, or is that if the helicopter is unable to respond, they respond in a road vehicle? Is that how it would work?
Yeah, so all of your ambulances have both helicopters and rapid response vehicles, and then depending on location of the job, weather constraints, other considerations, sometimes the helicopters break, they'll respond by road with exactly the same team and kit. And then we do have some only road-based services. There's only a handful of those in the UK, and some of those do carry blood, but none of those were included in this trial.
So for the trial, it was only people on helicopters or HEMS response. And were any of the road responses included in the trial at all as well, or just helicopter responses?
Yeah, so lots of the patients who were included in the trial were responded to with a HEMS team operating in a road vehicle, because sometimes that's how we respond. But it was 10 UK air ambulance services who took part.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Alex.
Yeah, no, congratulations again on coordinating all that effort for more than 900 patients. Maybe talk for a minute or two, sort of how it, how long does it take from this idea, you're observing all this interest in whole blood, when the two of you got together over a coffee and said, let's put this to the test. Like how long from that to when applications written, ethics approved, funding, and the whole thing is completed? Sounds like a lot of work.
Could I, Ed, do you want me to take this?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's very important for us to remember that we're quite lucky in the UK. I don't know about Australia. I think you also have a similar systems in that the blood service operates as a centralized national service. So that was first, is very important because it allowed us to work nationally with a lot of colleagues. So this is not just me, Ed, and the trial team. It has been a national effort. And I don't know if you remember in 2015 when the proper trial was published. The proper trial was a US randomized control trial that compared different ratios, 1:1:1 ratio of red cell plasma and platelet versus 1:1:2 ratio of the same components, but in hospital settings. And at that time, that trial, despite its limitations, it resulted in the national guidance recommending that we should be giving 1:1 ratio of red cell and plasma to all trauma patients who present with bleeding. And that recommendation was taken up quite quickly by the pre-hospital services, rightly so, because trauma patients don't really walk into the A&E and say, I'm going to have a trauma and just give me the 1:1 ratio quickly. They will be presenting outside hospitals. So our pre-hospital services are quite sort of forward-looking and very keen to take on innovation. So they very quickly started to transfuse red cell and plasma. And then in 2016, they approached the National Blood Service to say, well, giving all this separate component introduces a lot of logistical challenges like additional weight. We only get one intravenous access. Having to give too many components is not ideal. But also time is of essence. We shouldn't be like messing around on the scene to give too many components, but we should be moving those patients straight to hospital. So that at this point, they did ask for whole blood. This is in 2016. And we are now in 2026. So that is when in 2016 we agreed to have what we call a whole blood program, where we evaluated two different components, one of which was red cell and plasma combined, which we were able to give to the pre-hospital teams in 2016, but they didn't want that. They wanted whole blood, where there was a bit of platelet. So we said, okay, we will evaluate the red cell and plasma combined first, whilst we also look at the whole blood logistics. And then by 2020, we had already evaluated the red cell and plasma combined. And as you know, in 2020, we had COVID. A lot of research mind moved towards COVID response. However, we were quite lucky because the pre-hospital teams were still very keen to evaluate the whole blood. So 2020 to 2021, I think, at the peak of COVID, we were seeking funding. We only applied to the government initially, which was rejected. And then after that, we stepped back as a trial team and we thought, hold on, who really needs this component? And of course, the pre-hospital teams needs this component. The Ministry of Defense military. So we then talked to the leaders of those organizations together with the blood service, and we thought, can we bring this together? And we only had one Zoom meeting in 2021 with the key partners. After that, they all said yes, and it was just up to the team to turn it around. Once we then got all the approvals, we managed to complete recruitment 3 months ahead of schedule, and the total recruitment was about 18 months. So it was quite quick after that, and that shows that if it's a national effort and nationally people want this to happen, I think it will happen, and it will happen quite quickly. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but it has been a 10-year
Hey, Laura,
program of activity.
you raised some good points, Laura, with respect to some of the really valuable stuff we've learned by doing SWIFT with respect to how to get pre-hospital trauma trials to work effectively. You mentioned that we recruited 3 months ahead of schedule, and there's some really key things that we've learned from the trial that are going to really help us in future pre-hospital trauma trials.
Sorry, I've just got my dog that's just come in now as well. That's amazing stuff. And we've spoken about this, Alex and I, with regards to research previously about the idea that you can have in your head and the concept of putting things together and then gathering the data and then publishing and getting it published and all the rest of it is such a lengthy process. And so often, all this concept about blood administration, we're probably 5 years behind potentially what could be happening further down the track. One thing that I'm interested in, once again, the paramedic side of me talks about the logistics of carrying blood around. Does everybody, ambulance service-wise, HEMS, do they all use the same blood shippers?
I don't know, Ed, do you want to take this or?
Yeah, if you start, Laura, I can chip in the pre-hospital bit at the end.
I believe that they carry the same boxes, which we're very good at sharing practices in the UK between transfusion laboratories and emergency services. So they carry the same boxes that allow you to keep the blood cool, I think, depending on the seasons, but about 48 hours to 72 hours. I mean, if it's very hot weather, clearly it will drop, but I think most services carry similar boxes. And we saw that in SWIFT trial when we were setting up sites, they did have similar practices.
Yeah, so all of the blood supply comes essentially from NHS Blood and Transplant, which is really helpful in terms of coordinating a trial like this. The blood is actually normally moved from the lab to the air ambulance bases through a voluntary organisation, the Emergency Blood Bikers. That's not their official name, I don't think, but they're essentially volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing volunteers who normally late at night will transport blood from the laboratory to the air ambulance bases. And then some services, well, most services now actually have the ability to replan their blood supply during a duty period. So either they'll take a patient to the major trauma centre they're given blood to, and normally the blood lab is co-located with that major trauma centre, so they can phone ahead and then recollect, more blood. I guess part of this trial that's slightly different were the two ambulances who routinely use dried plasma, which is actually a medicine rather than a blood product, through regulation prior to it being mixed up prior to transfusion. And so, that's sourced from Germany, the lyoplas itself. So that, sort of slightly different. But in terms of the carriage of blood products, I'm pretty sure that all the services use Credo cubes, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So you can store blood components in those for, a couple of days and maintain their storage requirements.
Yeah, the Credo Crew cube is the same as what we use here in Victoria for the transport of our blood. And routinely our practice is a 24-hour rotation system to maintain that temperature at the right level. So works very well for us. We've spoken with Mark Yaser from Pittsburgh, and he's talked about they have a large fridge type product, which is in the back of their ambulances, which they transport the blood around, which is why I was interested to hear what you actually had for yours over there. And it's pleasing to hear the Credo boxes. That's good. Alex.
Yeah. Now, what about stats, methods, research? Is that okay, Shep? Please, that's interesting too. Some people can fast forward, but so a good study, you got to have an answerable question, the PICO. So like the patients would be, so this is traumatic hemorrhagic shock, and then you're comparing whole blood to packed red cells and plasma. What's the outcome? So the primary outcome in this study was a composite endpoint of either death or massive transfusion, sort of being defined as more than 10 units in a 24-hour period. Maybe, if you don't mind, talk to us about sort of, how you go about choosing a primary outcome and what you think about composite outcomes.
Yeah, I think, as I said, we did the predecessor study where we evaluated the red cell and plasma combined, and that meant that we were already engaging with pre-hospital services, with patients, with the blood service and the public, because our aim right at the beginning was to implement whole blood. And as part of that predecessor study, we did do a lot of work with patients, public, and clinicians around the design of the trial. The first thing we got from surveys and several workshops we had was that particularly clinicians in the emergency service wanted introduction of whole blood to be done following high quality evidence. And that really was really key. So they didn't want to have whole blood without good quality. So then we made the decision it will have to be a randomized control trial. And then as part of this close work with different stakeholders, we also asked them about, well, what matters to you? And this was a difficult part because depends on who you're asking. If you ask policymakers, clearly a cost-effective intervention matters more. But if you ask a patient, they would like to survive. And if you ask clinicians, particularly, as you know, over the last decades, there has been a lot of studies in pre-hospital settings, and we have moved towards looking from long-term outcomes strategy to more short-term outcomes, because we now understand that actually an intervention like blood transfusion is not going to have an impact long-term when these patients, once they come to hospitals, they have multiple problems that will intervene with your outcome. So I think everything was put together, and what matters to the services was also important. And that resulted in us looking at a combination of mortality and massive transfusion. Now, mortality is very easy. You know why we go for it, because it's survival. But the massive transfusion also demonstrates resources you have available. Is the country able to support you? If the intervention will result in reduction of overall transfusion. So that was very important for the blood service too. And then the timeline, we did sort of discuss whether it should be 30 days, 90 days, more composite outcome, 24 hours composite outcome. And I don't know if you remember, but right at the beginning when we were designing the study, REFILL trial was published. So this REFILL trial was another UK randomized control trial in pre-hospital setting that looked at cell line resuscitation versus transfusion resuscitation, and transfusion was given with red cell and lyoplase. But if you look at that study, the 24-hour outcome of that study, there was a strong signal that survival was better at 24 hours. And that also influenced our decision on the timeline for the composite outcome. But I think it was a lot of it took a lot of time for us to really agree that this was the most suitable outcome. It wasn't a straightforward process. You do have to consider a lot of stakeholders and the environment, other trials that are coming, how your trial will fit in. So, and I remember, I don't know if you remember, Ed, when we were applying for funding, it was sent out for peer review, and there were some criticism around the composite outcome, but also the time point that we chose. and the effect size that we went for, but I think we had already done the predecessor study that assisted us with all these decisions.
Yeah, so you have to, I mean, the existing evidence base for whole blood versus component therapy is, there's a small pilot RCT from Brian Cotton, I think published in like 2014, which actually, if you look into the paper, owing to the requirement to leukoreduce the blood product, actually was red cells and plasma rather than what we might refer to as a whole blood product. But all the rest of those data historically that are in multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and if you've got 3 or 4 systematic reviews all published in the same year on the same question, the answer is there isn't an answer. All of those show that we see this signal of early mortality benefit with whole blood versus component therapy, which doesn't translate to 30-day or longer term mortality benefits. But we also see a signal in some of those data that there might be a reduction in overall transfusion requirement with whole blood. So if you give whole blood early, it might be that you require fewer units of red cells, plasma, and other components within your hospital stay. And that's massively beneficial for all sorts of reasons in terms of cost, exposure of blood products to the patient, logistic supply. So if you have a good read of the underpinning evidence in existence around whole blood versus component therapy, you're very much led into the idea that early mortality combined with the need for massive transfusion is a pretty decent primary outcome to be looking at. Certainly the data that Laura referred to from the RESTORE trial, there was as I read it, there's a less than 1 in 12 chance that there's no difference in 3-hour mortality between red cells and plasma versus saline. So whilst it didn't reach significance, and I don't think it was a pre-specified, it certainly wasn't the primary outcome, we see this continually through almost all the blood trials that have been published to date. We see this early mortality benefit that doesn't translate into later survival, and there's a few reasons why that might be the case. But that led us into this primary outcome for SWIFT.
Yeah, very good. Very good. I'm going to go into the pre-hospital field again because that's where I like to play. The one of the questions or things that to consider is obviously you have 1 unit of whole blood and you spike the bag and you can give it straight into the patient as opposed to blood products that are separated and so forth. Is there any difference, or did you notice any difference in time with administration or issues associated with that, either on scene or due to having to spike multiple bags and so forth? Did that decrease the amount of substances that may have been given on the way to the hospital?
Yeah, so I'll start, Laura. I'm sure you've got something to say on this, please. So I don't think we have accurate timings for administration of different components within the data set. We know from there's a simulation study published in BMJ Military Health. It's open access, so you can have a look at that. It's called Combined Components, Simplifying Forward Resuscitation, a Flow Time and Resource Analysis of Pre-Hospital Transfusion. And that kind of states the obvious, which is if you're working pre-hospital, limited resources, limited people, limited vascular access, having a combined product, i.e. red and yellow together, with or without platelets, requires far fewer checks, touch time, resources, and personnel to deliver the same volume of transfusion. So, it kind of states the obvious, but we know that, and it makes sense, right, that if you have red and yellow in one bag, that's much preferable to the pre-hospital provider in that setting. And so we sort of know that through logic that having that would be beneficial, and through surveys we've done of the providers of this trial, we know that they massively prefer a single bag product. And when I say single bag products, I mean whether that's whole blood or it's red cells and plasma combined. They really want that for the reasons I've just stated. If you look at the if you look at one of the tables in the Swift paper, you can see that actually the number of units of different components transfused into both the whole blood arm and the single component arm are the same, in terms of, well, almost the same. And so we don't think there was an effect. I don't think there was an effect on the number of units given in the pre-hospital setting of the whole blood group versus the single component group. But Laura, what was your thoughts on that?
No, I think you answered the question spot on, actually, Ed. And we also, as part of the SWIFT trial, we did what is called an implementation study, where one of our members did a lot of sort of interviews with different stakeholders around the benefit of giving a separate component versus combined component. And it was interesting, Matt, because transfusion found it too complex to have to deal with many different components. But when you ask pre-hospital teams, it was just a unified sort of answer to those interviews, that giving a combined component is a lot easier for them, logistically easier and faster. So, and I mean, Ed, this is a work that Grazia Antonazzi did. She's one of the investigators in the trial, and we will be publishing that work. But it was quite overwhelming. The pre-hospital teams felt that whole blood was a lot easier to give.
Yeah,
and it's worth saying there's sorry, Matt. There's a bunch more data to come from Swift. So massively rich data set, but there's a whole bunch of other work that Laura just referred to that's yet to be published. So, watch this space, really.
Yeah. The clinicians that attended to the patient, did they have a criteria that they used, or was it on personal interpretation of when the patient actually required blood, or was there a set parameters that they worked within?
Yeah, so as a pragmatic trial, this was left down to the normal practices of those air ambulances. And I guess it's important when you consider the trial as a whole to say that these services are very mature in their experience of carrying and giving blood products. And so as a pragmatic trial, we utilize the normal standard operating procedures of those 10 air ambulances, which are very similar. But it leads us to another point, Matt, which is really important in all of this, which is how good are we pre-hospital at identifying patients who are bleeding to death? And the answer is not very good, right? And so we end up with all of these pre-hospital trauma trials of recruiting a spectrum of patients. So what we'd really like is to know beforehand which patient group is most likely to benefit from the intervention that we're testing. We don't know that, but we would suspect in a whole blood versus component therapy trial that it's patients who are bleeding to death. And we've all been to patients who you think are bleeding to death. It turns out they've got a really bad traumatic brain injury, vagal stimulation, something else. We give them maybe a unit of plasma and everything just sorts itself out. And then they get a CT scan and it turns out they're not bleeding at all. Right? And looking at all of us on this call, we've probably done this for a little while. And every day is still a school day out on the road or in the helicopter where I still get caught out with these patients. And so that's really tricky when you're trying to, work out a sample size and power a research trial in difficult circumstances. Undertaking pre-hospital research is really challenging. We then get this really heterogeneous mixed group of patients included in the trial. And that logically affects our ability to answer the question effectively.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Alex.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. A perpetual problem in emergency research, where you got to sort of randomize and enroll them within minutes of their presenting problem. It's not like you got 3 months in an outpatient clinic to look at all the scans and calculate their exact cancer number, score, whatever. So Yeah, hats off to you for all that work. But you mentioned your sample size and stuff. So, if I may, Matt, how about we go back to the stats?
You and your stats.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. So, you guys assumed the primary outcome would happen in 68% of patients, and then hope that the intervention would drop it down to 56. And, people could argue all day, 12%, it seems like a massive improvement. But in fact, what ended up happening is that in both groups, the primary outcome happened in just under half, like I think 48%. So both groups did far better than sort of assumed, I guess. So I think when it comes to sample size, one thing that you guys did that I haven't always seen written up is that sort of after, I think it was 300 patients, you had a look and adjusted the number required, which certainly there'd be other trials out there that don't do so. Just for my benefit, just talk to us about sample size and effect size and that calculation.
Yes, I mean, so as I said, we had already done the red cell and plasma study, which is published in the critical care journal. And that was instrumental in refining the sample size because, like Ed said before, there had been a lot of noise around whole blood based on observational studies. And if you go on those studies, actually the effect size was even larger than what we went for, but we used the red cell and plasma study to calculate our estimation, which was a difference, I think 12% absolute difference between the two arms, which is what you're referring to, Alex, the 68%. I think like Ed said also at the beginning, there had been no randomized control trial before to really come close to that estimation. And even the cotton paper was not a whole blood. This was a red cell and plasma combined, but we had better data than the cotton paper on the red cell and plasma combined because 6 pre-hospital services took part in that predecessor study. So, and that is why I think we came up with those figures. So we estimated that we would see 12% absolute difference in the primary outcome, and the assumption was made on 85% power. And we had already pre-specified that we would do an interim analysis after the 400 participants were recruited. The other thing we also pre-specified in the trial, being a pragmatic trial, we knew that we would have to also enroll patients who were in non-traumatic hemorrhage and patients who had traumatic cardiac arrest. They would be enrolled, but the latter group would not be included in the primary analysis because the survival rate on that group is different to non-traumatic cardiac arrest. So after removing these two groups, then we thought that we would need around 848 participants. And as you saw in the paper, when the first 300 participants were randomized, the sample size had to be adjusted because the observer event rate was lower than what we had anticipated, which is the reason why we sort of pre-specified that, because we wanted to assess our adjustment. And that's where we ended up. And I think the other thing to remember over time, survival in trauma patients, and I've seen that in the last 15 years, it's just improved. And that is because there's so much innovation going on at the moment, which is a good thing for our patients. But it does mean that doing trials in the future is gonna get more challenging.
I think there are probably two. I mean, in my mind, Alex, there are a couple of reasons to answer the specific question around this, like 68 to 48 question, right? So the previous data demonstrated that we're likely to see a 60% incidence of the primary outcome. And then we observed, about 48 in the trial. And I think, a really positive spin on that is that trauma care is just generally improving, right? And we couldn't, we might have expected that, but we had to work with the data that we had. I think a second reason might be this thing about time. So the ambulances that took part in that study that demonstrated that it might be around a 68% incidence of the primary outcome, I think, have generally shorter response times than the UK as a whole. And so if you're getting to patients later, then a proportion of those patients have already exsanguinated and died. And so you're left with this cohort who are potentially less severely injured, less likely to die. And that might be part of the explanation. Hopefully it's also because trauma care has improved in the intervening years, but I think that might be part of the answer too.
Right. Yeah, good answers. And I think the problem with any sort of research in this space, as you're both saying, it's improving. Like the better something is, the harder it is to improve it, isn't it? So, like if we're going to start looking for trials and intervention for the 1 or 2% gain, if you run the sample size on that, you'd need 10,000 patients, and then that'll take a decade, and there'll be other changes during that time. So, no, hats off to you. That was
It's worth saying
a
as well,
great
Alex. I
balance,
mean,
I think.
you've alluded to it, but essentially we're in this situation where we want to answer a question that's really valid. Our patients want an answer. Our services need an answer. But we are constrained by actually being able to deliver a trial. And so if you look at the number of patients who might fit the inclusion criteria, even at 10 of the highest recruiting ambulances in the UK, it would be unreasonable to run a trial for more than about 3 years. And so you start to look at the available numbers, and that inevitably ends up with you having an effect size, so that 12% reduction that is, manageable in order to be able to answer the question with the resources available. So there is some compromise in all of this.
Yeah. Right. Shep, you got us back to the clinical quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Here I go. Righto. So what's your HEMS average response times? You mentioned some of them are really short, and obviously some of them are a bit longer. And then with managing these patients, I'm all about how long we spend at scene and so forth, because I know sometimes our crews can be at scene for longer than what they need to be. And I'm wondering if that was ever an issue, or you found that people were very proactive in moving towards definitive care.
Yeah. So, I mean, the elephant in the room, I suppose, with respect to UK US comparisons is that UK pre-hospital times are quite a bit longer. And so last time I looked at the data, not just for helicopter EMS, but for EMS generally, the time from injury to hospital arrival for patients not trapped was about 60 minutes, which increases to about 90 minutes if the patient's trapped. And so if you compare that to US EMS data, that is significantly longer. So we've got a much longer pre-hospital period. Part of that might be geography. Part of that might be that we've got a pretty well-developed network of physicians, CCP, air ambulances. And so there's stuff that happens at scene that you might not want to deliver in the US, like pre-hospital emergency anesthesia, etc. So our pre-hospital times are relatively long. I don't think we report the median pre-hospital times in the paper, Laura, do we?
I think we have reported those in the supplemental appendix, because I think that was one of the pre-specified analysis we looked at, the 20 minutes less than and more than as per previous trials. I think we did look at it and we did have those times, but we saw no difference. But overall, as Ed said, we didn't have very long distances. And I think this was also consistent with the refill trial, actually. And refill trial was done in exactly the same. So I think it's quite nice to see that the two trials were quite consistent with regards to timing.
And the 20 minutes that Laura's referring to is data that comes from 2 US trials, Pamper and Combat, who both tested early 2 units of plasma. And as you might already know, there appeared to be a significant benefit in early mortality, in 28-day mortality, actually, if pre-hospital transport times were greater than 20 minutes in favour of giving early plasma. And so that's where that number comes from.
Yeah. I'm still trying to understand the whole UK HEMS service. So 10 HEMS services. Out of each of those, do they run one helicopter or multiple helicopters? And then geographically, what sort of, I don't know if you have the answers to this one, this is me going off on my little tangent, what sort of distances are they covering on a average HEMS job?
Yeah, I can answer that. So we had quite a good, essentially a pre-trial survey some years ago now, answered some really important questions for us. So some important stuff about whether our ambulances were interested in taking part in pre-hospital blood transfusion studies, how much blood they carried, how many patients they'd seen. It's really important for us to approach the air ambulances who had the highest case volume so we could recruit effectively to the trial. That resulted in us recruiting from lots of different parts of the UK. So that included around London, the Southeast, Midlands, South Coast, and the Northeast. So quite a decent geographic spread. And what that does as well is it massively mixes up the sort of urban and rural countryside, longer transport times, longer response time services. So there was a really good spread of different services. I think probably ends of the spectrum are probably London's Air Ambulance, which is, you know, a very urban system with very fast response times and pretty quick pre-hospital transport times to one of 4 major trauma centres in London. And we compare that to the Great North Air Ambulance service that's often responding into mountainous, remote locations with much longer response times. So in answer to your first question, Matt, there's a real range. So of the air ambulances that took part, some have a single base with a single helicopter and a car. I guess the sort of median's probably 2 bases spread out across a region. And I think one of them included in the trial has 3 bases. But so around 2 bases is typical for each service. My own service in the east of England, we cover about 20,000 square kilometres and a population of 6.5 million people. And we can get anywhere in the region within about 20 minutes. So I guess, you know, the response times for UK ambulances will be somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes for anywhere in their region.
Yeah, okay. I'm just thinking here in Victoria, we have 5 helicopters, and I think our geography is about 243,000 square kilometres. But we only have 5 helicopters covering all of our state, and obviously our transport times are much, much longer, and that is to the scene, but also away from the scene and back to a trauma centre as well. So it actually, next time you do it, give us a heads up and we'll get involved as well, and you can look at some longer transport times and how they may impact the study.
So I don't to come back, because I think Canadians are Matt, are currently doing the SWIFT trial in kind of because of the same reason that you mentioned, Matt, the distance. So I think I'm sure they will be very interested to talk to you, but it does take time to set up the study. They should be close to completion, but I think that is what we're trying to do. They say, look, we're slightly different from the UK. But if you're interested, I'm very happy to put you in touch with the chief investigator of that arm of the trial.
Lovely, thank you, Alex.
Great, thanks. So, what are the implications of this? You know, you've compared components with whole blood, and there's no difference. What shall we do next?
I think Ed sort of mentioned at the beginning, I think, watch this space because there is more to come from SWIFT trial. We have not completed our work. We set out to also look at health economic evaluation, which is absolutely key. So that is the next paper to come. And the second implementation study, which is looking at what all users think about the whole blood versus component therapy. And we will need to put this together for as far as the UK is concerned. Second, I think we've got, I think there is an American trial very similar to SWIFT trial, pre-hospital setting, who has completed recruitment, I've been told, and they should be looking at publishing their data this year. So we also need to wait for that study, that trial. I think it is very important when we're looking at these trials coming through now. There'll be also another one in pediatric settings. But I think the pediatric group, I think they're looking at up to 8 units of whole blood. So it's slightly different. So that's why when these trials are coming through now, we need to really scrutinize the intervention versus standard of care in those trials, because they are not the same. And that is very important. But we will have to wait for those results too. We will take those into consideration together with health economic evaluation and the implementation study. And we will make a decision on whether we implement whole blood in the UK or not. But I don't think the first part of the results we've just published has given us a definite answer.
Yeah,
So
so
watch
I mean, what's really encouraging is that a bunch of people are looking into this question, and in different settings. We talked a bit today about transport time, standard operating procedures, but also the component itself. So not everyone will be using the identical whole blood component. So when people talk about whole blood, you need to be slightly cautious. We've touched on it, with respect to previous studies. Some previous studies with whole blood in the title is actually red cells and plasma mixed together, which we would term RCP, red cells and plasma. And so having different services and different organizations around the world using different products, different settings, asking questions about whole blood versus component therapy is massively valuable in terms of trying to really untangle what we can get from this for our patients. So, Tower is the US pre-hospital study. There's an in-hospital study called TROOP, and then MATIC-2 is the pediatric study that Laura referred to. So lots more data coming out on this in the future. I think in terms of what this means for me, I think we're very quick to sort of gloss over some of the lessons identified through trying to undertake these trials. And we've touched on it a bit today, but something that was really useful, or a few things that were really useful about the SWIFT trial that made it recruit 3 months earlier than we were expecting, was stakeholder investment. So the air ambulances taking part actually paid alongside NHSBT and the Ministry of Defence to be part of the trial. So they were really invested in trying to recruit patients. The randomization happened in the labs as well. So their ambulances were delivered a box that contained either the whole blood or the component therapy. They arrived at a patient. There were no forms to fill out. There was nothing else to do, no random blood test to take. If they wanted to give blood to anybody, even if they were a medical hemorrhage, pregnant, prisoner, met all the exclusion criteria, it didn't matter. They just opened the box they were carrying and gave the patient what was inside the box. What that led to was almost default recruitment. So we couldn't afford to have patients not recruited because it was too complicated. The patients were too sick. I can remember trying to recruit patients to the refill study previously. And I had a few patients who were frankly too sick for me to be able to undertake the trial admin pre-hospital and keep the patient alive. So they weren't recruited. So what also helped was that because whole blood has been so big on Twitter in the last 10 years, all of these services really wanted whole blood. And the only way they could get whole blood was to be part of the trial. So we've learned a lot in terms of, stakeholder investment, attractive intervention, default recruitment that's going to really help us as we go forward, trying to further unravel this area of medicine.
I noticed the time. We're up to 50 minutes already. So I think we need to start thinking about your final question for us, Alex, if you've got one on the tip of your tongue there. And then I think we better wrap it up. It's actually getting dark here as well. I need to go and turn the light on.
Now look, thanks, Ed. That's a great summary of a lot of lessons. I think people who just sort of read an abstract or aren't deep into this, they'll sort of look at this and say, oh, well, there was no difference between the two groups and forget about it. But tons of learnings there, so that's great to
Alex,
see.
can I just say there was no difference? That's very important to distinguish. I think Our
please.
trial showed that whole blood was not superior to standard of care, and vice versa. Standard of care was not superior, but I think that it wasn't a negative trial. It showed that whole blood at least is, well, I can't say that. We can't even say it's as good as standard of care, but it was just not superior. So we don't need to wait for other bits to now decide where we go with whole blood. So I don't think it's the end of the whole blood.
Yeah.
And the safety signal shouldn't be overlooked either. So essentially, Swift also demonstrates that there is no adverse safety signal from a whole blood component.
Yeah. But to all those eager people on Twitter, Ed, that you're talking about, that sort of all wanting whole blood, you'd think that after 900 patients or 600 that were analysed or so, that there'd be a stronger signal if it was that good. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, maybe, although, people, I've mentioned it before, but the setting and the exact intervention and the timings are really important. So we saw this effect with tranexamic acid. So, CRASH 2, the largest ever trial in emergency care, 20,000 patients recruited, lots of different settings around the world, and an incredible reduction in terms of cost. 67 patients treated with TXA, you save one life, it costs almost nothing. But it took the United States many years to come on board with that idea, with some very valid arguments that the setting and the patients didn't reflect that of the United States. And so the whole blood story is definitely not over. We have demonstrated that whole blood isn't superior for this outcome with this component in this population with this timings. And that's really important. There are massive benefits pre-hospital and in difficult settings to having a single bag product. And as Laura said, we haven't published all the data from Swift yet, and there's a lot more to come.
Yeah. No, great. Yeah, then we had some issues or concerns down here with the CRASH 2 trial findings as well, and that's why the patch trial born out of Victoria, a difference in 6 months functional outcome with a shot of TXA near the time of injury. Speaking of, to choose an appropriate time frame for the outcomes. Yeah, no, fascinating. Any final message you want to leave?
I think
Laura?
for me, the final message is just, the trial showed that it wasn't superior. We looked at the optimal standard of care. That is very important to understand, and that means we gave red cell and thawed plasma. The other thing is, could we have looked at, I wish we could have given more whole blood, but we couldn't because of the logistical issues there. I think what I would take away from this trial is the people that were involved that made this trial possible. The 10 air ambulance charities, the National Blood Service and the Ministry of Defence, who co-funded and supported the recruitment of this trial, and of course patients, blood donors, the clinical trials unit, and everyone who was involved. There was a huge number of people that were involved here, and I'd like to acknowledge them and thank them for making this trial a possibility.
And I just say, don't throw away your whole blood. The message from this study is not that whole blood doesn't work. So there's lots of benefits to a single bag product. The story's not over, and whole blood is not dead.
So true.
Yeah, good.
And I think, a lot more research will come out of this area. Obviously, you've mentioned the further stuff to come from the Swift trial itself, but I'm sure there'll be many people hot on your heels, which will be wanting to generate further research out of this as well. So I'll pull us up there. I think, 55 minutes in, that is a great session and a great summation of the Swift trial. So thank you both to Laura and Ed for your time today. I really do appreciate it. We feel very honoured that you came on and actually spoke to us. So Very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. I
Thanks
will
so
leave
much.
it there.
Thank you for
Good on
having
you
us.
guys. Thank you very much for coming on Pre-Hospital Nerds. Thanks a lot.
Nice to see you. Bye.